Welcome to A Quaker Take on Immigration. A Quaker Take is a podcast on Quakers in Britain discussing a Quaker perspective on the world.
I'm John.
And I'm Elizabeth.
So today we're looking at a Quaker perspective on immigration, and we're going to explore that by looking at the people who are working on immigration, because lots of Quakers are campaigning on it, doing lots of work on it.
So we're kind of talking about a sort of general approach to how we think about immigration in the UK, but also thinking more specifically about the ways that we support refugees and asylum seekers and how we build a fairer system in this country and kind of around the world on immigration.
So you've been talking to a couple of people who are actually based in this building, haven't you?
Yes, I've been talking to Tatiana Garavito, who supports Sanctuary Meetings, which is part of campaigning to end the hostile environment in the UK, and also is about building sort of a wider racial justice movement amongst Quakers. And then I've also been chatting to Jess Metheringham, who is the Parliamentary Engagement Officer, for a look at how we might be able to influence government policy on this at the moment.
Yeah, very interesting stuff. And I've been interviewing someone called Bridget Walker, who is a Quaker who's part of the Quaker Asylum and Refugee network. And we talk about the work that Quakers are doing to support asylum seekers and refugees. We talk explicitly about the work that she's been doing with the Campsfield Immigration Detention Centre, as well as the wider history of why are Quakers doing this work? What calls us to do this work? What's the history of it? She shares a lot of sort of stories that maybe you wouldn't hear unless you were working on the front lines of this work. So
kind of the stuff that's not covered in the news.
Yeah, I came away from that conversation. It was, parts of it are quite harrowing, and you was like, blimey, I really learnt a lot. So lots to unpack in this episode. Let's find out what a Quaker Take on immigration is.
I'm here with Jessica Metheringham and Tatiana Garavito. This is a Quaker Take on immigration. What is the Quaker position on immigration?
Hello, thank you so much for having us here. Quakers in Britain released a manifesto a couple of years ago in December 2017, and on that manifesto they laid out some of the positions on immigration at the time. What the manifesto says, and this can be found online, is that they see that of God in everybody, and they see the humanity in every single person that exists, I guess, in this planet. And in that manifesto, they also talk about the ways in which the immigration system is affecting and violating people's human rights. And they talk about things like immigration detention and how that affects thousands of people in this country, and the fact that they want to close down immigration detention. They also talk about families being able to reunite with other members of the families. They talk about having a system that is humane and compassionate, and that is built in believing people and the stories and the cases that they share with Home Office or officials. So I think our position on immigration is one that, and I imagine that this is also something that different Quakers will have different views on, but the main position on immigration is that we want a system that is humane, that is compassionate, and that believes people's stories and people's life experiences.
Yeah, I think that really says it all. That starting from the position that we're all human, that we should be believed, that people shouldn't be locked up without cause, that people should be able to exist just as we do, that we start in different places, that actually where you are born shouldn't condemn you to a life of war, to a life of famine. So I think that's our starting point.
The other thing to say about this is that we Quakers care about other things. We want to stop wars. We want a world that is equal for everyone. We want a world that is sustainable. And I think all of those aspects of or values or principles that we're concerned about are also connected to the immigration work that we do. And so therefore is also our position. So we can't separate immigration from war or inequality around the world, because those are the things that fuel immigration and actually make people having to migrate and seek asylum in other places. It's also connecting all of those issues, and that's part of our position as Quakers, as an organization.
Okay. Because, I mean, it makes sense to not think of things in isolation, that they're all connected in different ways, and one thing does impact other people, and all of those policies are different. Mm-hmm. So why are we focusing on this now?
So we're focusing on this now because this is a big issue for society. To a certain extent, we want to set the agenda, to say, these are the important things, these should be the priorities, but we're also led by other people. So at the moment, there should be an immigration bill going through Parliament. There was one laid just before Christmas, but of course, with the current political turmoil, we're not entirely sure when the next stage of that will be. But this represents a time when we can speak out most effectively. So now is a time to write to your MP, to tell your MP what you think about family reunion, to tell them about campaigns such as the right to work for those seeking asylum, to also talk about things such as the burden of proof that those who are seeking asylum get put under by the Home Office, where they are seeking to prove that they are fleeing from violence, to prove that they've been tortured, but what they have to prove is so huge and overwhelming that it is nearly impossible for them to do that.
That burden of proof, like obviously we've used the word burden there. What do we actually mean by trying to prove that something happened? Either proving that you're gay or proving that you've been tortured. What are the things that is required, and why does that make it difficult?
So the Home Office has a set of criteria, usually, which they will go through and they will say, right, how do we know that you are not fabricating your story? How do we know that you are genuinely fleeing persecution? But those people who are seeking asylum find that it is really difficult to provide the level of information that the Home Office requires, that the Home Office is asking for things which are impossible often to provide. They're asking people to prove that they believe something, for example, which literally cannot be done.
Yeah. And I think this is the reason why our program is not only a program that works on immigration matters, but our program is a racial justice program. Because, and so we are working on this now, and I think this is not new for Quakers. Quakers have worked on racial justice for many, many years. And we started, for instance, working to stop slave trade. And if you look at history, race has been used, has been fabricated in order to oppress certain people, and a lot of the times to blame them for things that the system is not providing. And so, for instance, the immigration system as we have it today is a system that uses race and uses the fact that you're from another place to put, well, first of all, because it's profit driven. If you look at how much money you have to pay for making applications, or it's a lot of money that is involved in all of that.
So it's making money for the Home Office rather than
there's a
just being
deterrent
administrative
aspect there. So people are deterred from applying due to the cost, which is part of the reason for the cost.
Yeah, but it's also very important to recognize that the issues that we have at the moment are issues of inequality, are issues to do with a system, an economic system that is oppressing a lot of people. But migration and race are used to blame as a group of society for everything that is happening. So we are also, as Quakers, interested in this work at the moment, because there is, again, a group of people that are being blamed and abused and violated on the basis of their race and their immigration status. And as I was saying before, this is something that Quakers have been working on for many, many years.
So you asked why is the time earlier. This is a really good time because there's momentum around several things to do with detention. Mm-hmm. So there are detention centres which have been closed down. There are detention centres which perhaps are close to being closed down. So giving that extra push now might be enough to keep up the momentum to close down more detention centres.
You mentioned a bit about all the rhetoric and the blame kind of culture around like blaming people who've immigrated to the country for a lot of the problems in society. How are we wanting to change that conversation nationally, and how are we working to challenge some of that blame rhetoric?
Sure. So our racial justice work through Sanctuary Everywhere, one of the aims that we have is to creating a culture of welcome and hospitality. So all of the rhetoric and the messaging against migration and against people from refugee and migrant backgrounds is being fueled by the media and by some politicians that are using this to capitalize and, you know, like to get more people involved in the work. But this is not the reality in many places on the ground. And so what we're doing through the program is actually getting people to speak out about the importance of coming together as communities to change or to challenge a culture of blame and hatred. So we are sort of like nurturing those relationships in communities through the program. And something that we're doing, for instance, is encouraging friends, Quakers, to write stories about the amazing work that they're doing with people from migrant and refugee communities in their places, to talk about projects that they're running, and also in many ways to, if you are a person of color in society, you are treated differently because of the structures that we have in place. And friends are also trying to understand the power dynamics in all of those things. So we are challenging that culture of hatred, blame, and division with one of hospitality, welcoming families and people from around the world in our communities, and understanding the power dynamics in those as well.
I think it's really important for those of us who have privilege to recognise what a huge privilege it is. So that's something that Friends on the Bench can do, can say, actually, what do I have that I can give? How can I recognise my position, and how can I use this to help other people by challenging that rhetoric of hatred?
Mm-hmm. A few months ago we had a conversation about allyship and solidarity. Mm-hmm. Would you say then that this work is very clearly a part of working on being in solidarity with people?
Yeah, I will say so. So, as we know, Quakers are at this moment in time quite privileged in many ways, and I think that this program is allowing friends to work with people that are having a very, very difficult time, having to face the immigration system, as Jess said, being locked up in detention centers, but also facing borders and violence throughout society. So if you're a person from a migrant or refugee background, and if you're trying to access help, for instance, it's very, very difficult for you. So I mean, friends are doing all sorts of things to work in solidarity with communities across the country. And they're also using their privilege, as Jess said, to say, we are not accepting this, we're not tolerating this. Also because, as we have seen in history in the past, once a group of people start to be blamed, or at the moment, for instance, if you are a British citizen and if you marry someone from a different part of the world, you will also have to face the immigration system yourself. You will also be put, like, the threshold for salaries for people that are trying to bring their families over here is very, very high at the moment. So if you're a working class British citizen, that will also be very difficult for you. Quakers are recognizing that we can't, that what happens to other people in our communities is happening to us as well, because there is a connection, spiritual connection in each of us. And that in politics, that's usually what happens, that all of those issues start to affect one group and then other groups as well, and ourselves as well.
Okay. This does all sound like really great and everything, that we should have a more compassionate and just immigration system that welcomes people, but surely we don't think that we should just let everyone in.
See, that's a really interesting question, because, so on the one hand, there are borders which exist. Though they have been created by humans, we have nation states which have existed for a long time, which have certain setups within them. So they have institutions, they have things like health services, they have social security, they have welfare. And to say that we should globalise that whole thing, that's a big ask. Maybe in the future that would be brilliant to do. So it is a balance between saying, what can a state practically do to support people, and what should it morally do? Because human beings are human beings, no matter where they come from. And we need to remember that in all of our dealings with people. We need to remember that they are human beings just like us.
And I also think that is quite interesting when that question gets raised, because I wonder why we're not talking about the same, but with corporations, for instance. I come from Latin America, and my family and a lot of people in my community has been displaced for hundreds of years because of corporations coming to exploit the land for resources, for gold, for, all sorts of things. Most of these corporations come from the West. We never talk about the fact that corporations are going everywhere to exploit the land and displace communities from their territories. So it's just very interesting that we're not talking about the full picture here. And it's also important to say that, actually people from those places that are facing climate breakdown and that are facing poverty and inequality because of corporations coming to the land and displacing them. We're not talking about the fact that it is countries next to them that are actually taking people seeking asylum. So here in the West, it is true that a lot of people come here, but it is countries around the world, especially in the global south, that are having to deal with big numbers of people migrating.
So that thing about corporations and money, that's really important, because our entire culture is set up with this idea that money is allowed to cross borders, that companies can be global companies, and that states can talk to each other and can do various types of interacting which individuals can't. Now, obviously, these are two different things.
Totally. And it's also, and this raises another question, and is that if those people that were coming over here in boats and the pictures that were on newspapers were not people of color, were maybe white people, we will not be thinking or having the same conversations here. And this is, again, because immigration is about constructing a person that can be othered. And in history, we're saying that it's people of color, those who can be othered and that can be dehumanized. I think a lot of the times when we see headlines on newspapers or questions like that, I think we need to be a bit more curious about what's the bigger picture that we're not seeing.
What's the language that we're using?
Yeah.
Because you talk about the migrants coming in. Well, we call them migrants because of where they come from. We don't call them expats, or rather, we do call them expats, but from different countries. And we still have these narratives going on here. So the language we use to describe people is really informative. We also need to think about why they are coming to our country, why they are not stopping in countries closer to their own. Quite often it's because the risk is still there. Quite often it's because we put the risk there, that they are fleeing wars which we help fund, for example.
I think one question that often comes up, particularly I think over Christmas when people were coming from Calais, and like that question that always seems to arise, particularly when it's sort of European Union wide, is about, well, why aren't people just claiming asylum in the first country they get to?
So Britain colonized the whole world. We know that, right? We went around the world to take resources from everywhere.
My favourite fact about this is that there are, I think, only 22 countries in the world
that were not.
That the UK has not either invaded or occupied.
That's right. So we have links with most countries around the world. And links are not only corporations that are in those places taking resources, but also connections with people. Because if we have gone there, then we will have family members, we will have children, grandchildren, whatever. And a lot of the times people who are trying to come to the UK are trying to come here because they might have family members. That's an interesting question because, again, we can't answer those questions without looking at history and without looking at the wider picture.
And if you think about it, suppose that you are fleeing your country. You have a choice between one country which you have barely heard about, or you can go to a country which has a significant part in your country's history, perhaps has sought to portray itself as a benevolent protector of your country through colonizing it, and where you know the language, you know many of the customs. Which one would you choose? Would you choose a country which is completely unknown to you, or would you choose the country which has pushed upon your country its sense of what a civilization ought to look like, you'd probably go to the latter, which is why they're coming here. And of course, there's also the fact that most of them are not coming here. We are getting a tiny, tiny percentage. But you compare that to the refugee crisis, which happened about 2 years ago, where Greece was accepting thousands and thousands of migrants. This is a very, very small number who are coming to us.
I find it really interesting that one of the things that has come up quite a lot is about the use of the word migrants. And every time I hear it on the radio, I keep thinking, like, why are we using this word? It feels so dehumanizing, when actually what that means is that means X number of people, X number of children, X number of women, X number of men, X number of other people. It's not just about labeling people. And I feel like sometimes that gets missed in this whole narrative.
This is the power of language, that you can talk about people swarming into our country. You can talk about vermin, people were called. And you think that just... Cockroaches, that brings a lump to people's throat, and they think, oh, how is that possible? But actually, what we are really talking about are human beings seeking sanctuary. And it's important to keep going back to that, to say no matter what some sections of the press may be trying to get us to think, trying to place these visions of people swarming into the country in our minds, they are human beings and they are seeking sanctuary just like anybody else would do in their circumstances.
And I will add another line. They are people seeking sanctuary because of wars and inequality that we created.
Would you say that Quakers are mostly focused on supporting refugees and asylum seekers then?
I think this takes us back to a conversation that we just had about the terminology that is used to segregate or to divide people into or dehumanize us. I come from a place that has been at war for over 60 years, but the international community did not recognize that place to be at war until very, very recently. I wasn't able to go anywhere seeking asylum, but only by being a migrant in law terms. I think we need to be very careful with those terms because they help to divide people into categories. Quakers are working with people that are facing the weight of the immigration system. For instance, last year we were working very closely with people that got caught up in the whole Windrush scandal. They were not seen as asylum seekers, but maybe migrants or not even that, because they were also British citizens. So it's people that have been othered and that are facing the weight of the immigration system. So in that, I think we're working with people from migrant, refugee backgrounds and also people seeking asylum. People come here to seek asylum because the conditions being created in the global south are not what we need, right? Because of violence, because of poverty, because of inequality. And they come here as well to work because we all want to have a better life. And this is not only the case for people seeking asylum, but for every single one person on this planet. It is important to say also that people from migrant backgrounds and refugee backgrounds throughout history have also been invited to come to the UK to work, to build roads, to build trains, to build the NHS, to work for the NHS, and so on and so forth. So labor from people that come from other parts of the world, which sometimes is paid very badly, it's quite cheap labor, has helped to build this country as well.
So it's really looking at this quite holistically then about, well, how do we change things in terms of climate change? How do we change things in terms of inequality in the world? That's a whole lot of things that need to change.
This is very cross-cutting.
Yes.
I mean, actually, like climate change at the moment is one of the most important conversations that we need to be having because of the way we consume, because we have an economic system that extracts from everything, people and resources and the world, we're facing climate change. And this means that a lot of people are going to have to migrate, are going to have to leave their homes. And this is happening already in Bangladesh, in India, places in Latin America, and in many other places. So we need to be looking at our economic system, and we also need to be looking at how is it that we're going to welcome people that are going to have to migrate because of the way we live in the planet at the moment.
there's quite a lot of big picture thinking about how we need to change the entire global economic system. That feels like quite a lot, and I don't know, I feel a bit small in that process. What's the stuff I can do right now if I wanted to try and change things?
Well, that's a very good question. So, currently going through Parliament, there's this immigration bill. Writing to your Member of Parliament to say, actually, the things we're talking about on immigration, or rather the things that society at large are talking about, are not really what we should be talking about. We're not focusing on the humanity of people. So that's one concrete thing that you can do right now.
Okay.
We also have sanctuary meetings, so groups of Quakers that are taking action on anti-detention, anti-deportation and anti-destitution work. And that is going to visit people in detention centers, supporting groups that are taking direct action to stop charter flights. This means opening our meeting houses for groups that are working on racial justice. This means hosting people from migrant and refugee communities in our homes and in our meeting houses as well. This means doing whatever it takes, and what we talked about in our previous podcast, finding out what is it that communities need and trying to work with them to resolve some of those, practical issues that communities have, as well as changing the law. I also feel that there's a lot of work that is being done at the moment on understanding our power and privilege, not only on a personal level, but how power and privilege works at a global level. So what's the power dynamics with the West and other parts of the world? Because by understanding that, we can also force members of parliament, politicians, to come up with policies that really connect to our values and our principles. So yeah, I think those are some of the things that people can do, understanding themselves as well as taking action and showing solidarity for what communities are facing.
I think that coming together as a group of local people and saying, actually, what do we want to do? Just sitting down, talking to people and saying, can we as a group of us say run a group for local people who need support? Can we befriend some people? Can we go and do something? But just getting together with others and having that conversation, that's the first step.
Mm-hmm. Totally, yeah. I think I often say that our conversations don't need to be about being right. We need to think about how can we transform together as communities? How can we transform together as people? Instead of just trying to sort of just give a fact or a statistic, which actually sometimes or a lot of the times don't work. Let's see what are the questions that people have, and let's just talk about those and try to understand and listen to each other more.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay, great. I feel like I've got lots of practical tips on what I can do now, so I'm going to go and look those up.
Hearing from Jess and Tatiana, it really struck me how much it mirrored what I was talking to with Bridget, and how it all seems to be quite linked in, which I guess shows the strength of the underpinnings and the foundations of this work. It seems to me remiss, if we're talking about a Quaker take on immigration, not to talk about the Sanctuary Everywhere manifesto.
Yeah, the manifesto kind of reaffirmed Quakers' commitment to challenging oppression and discrimination in the immigration system, and that really building a system that is based much more on compassion, that's based much more on truth and believing people's stories. And I think probably some of what you were talking to Bridget about is really about what kind of practical things does that bring to working with people more directly. So this sort of visioning document, when you actually apply that on the ground, what does that look like? And that's really what you've been talking to Bridget about, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. That was part of the conversation. And I guess people often say that Quakers don't have a position on things, but actually in this case, when it is often an issue-based thing, it is something that lots of Quakers are feeling called to work on. We can get together with the manifesto and say, no, actually this is what we think about this right now, and this is maybe what practically it looks like. So yeah, I think the best thing really is to let Bridget talk a little bit about the work that she's been doing and what it means to her specifically.
So I'm here with Bridget Walker. Do you want to introduce yourself, Bridget?
Well, hello. I'm a Quaker, and I'm a member of the Quaker Asylum and Refugee Network, and also of what used to be the Close Campfield campaign. It's now Close Campfield and End All Detention.
Okay. So can you tell me a bit about what the Quaker Asylum Refugee Network is?
Yes, we've been on the go since 2006, and it's really a network of Quakers around the British Isles who had a concern about our immigration and asylum policy. I think we felt that both the policy and the practice were fatally flawed, and that we needed to advocate for a fairer, more just and compassionate system externally, for instance, through making submissions to parliamentary inquiries, and also to raise awareness among friends. And I think the feeling among Quakers around the country is really revealed through the fact that there's now nearly 100 Quaker meetings who've signed up to be sanctuary meetings. Within the Quaker Asylum Refugee Network, there are many champions of the sanctuary meetings, and we shall be holding a conference in September this year where Tatiana will certainly be playing a key role, and where we will also hope to have Quakers from the Quaker Council for European Affairs and the Quaker UN office. And we hope that in these rather bleak times, one of the things that we will be doing is offering some solidarity and encouragement. Quakers have had an office at the UN both in Geneva and in New York, and have a particular concern in the Geneva office to relate to the UN High Commissioner for Refugees office and look at human rights issues, as well, of course, as broader things like our traditional concern about peace and disarmament and the growing concern about environment and climate. And the Quaker Council for European Affairs is a newer body and has been particularly concerned about the situation for people forced to migrate and arriving in Europe seeking safety.
Yeah, okay. That sounds really productive. So there's both kind of engaging at all the different levels. And is that kind of what the sanctuary meetings are trying to do as well?
That's right. So we will hear from our UN office about the global level at which the global compacts on refugees and migration are trying to get governments to pursue a more humane approach. And certainly the Quaker Council for European Affairs will have a lot to say about what is happening with Fortress Europe and the things like the increasing security budget that the EU has voted, the walls that are going up, and the spectre of the far right, which is affecting people coming from outside and, as I said, seeking safety, but often finding a very different situation, a very hostile environment.
And Quakers have been quite vocal in terms of opposing that. And where do you think that comes from?
I think if you look at our history, Quakers have had a concern for a very long time. I think some people would say back to the arrival of the Huguenots in Britain, but certainly I think we've always had a global outlook, so that takes you internationally into, how people become refugees, but with practical action on the ground. And certainly I know relief committees were set up for refugees from the Franco-Prussian War, so that's back in the 1870s, and the South African War at the end of the 19th century. And then there was Quaker support for children caught up in the Spanish Civil War in the 1930s, which was predated our involvement in the Kindertransport, which rescued 10,000 Jewish children from Nazi Europe. So there is a history, and British and American Quakers ran refugee camps in Europe after the Second World War. And in the present century, I think we all in our different places have engaged in all sorts of situations where we support people when we see the injustice that seems to be part of a system that has quite explicitly been described as a hostile environment.
And do you think it's that sense of injustice that makes Quakers want to take action on this?
I think it's both injustice and the feeling of our fellow humanity. We are all, we all say that we encounter God in one another, and so often people who come here are described in very dehumanizing terms. So it's also trying to say we're all in this together, we are all human, and we encounter God in one another.
And you mentioned that you were involved in, was it Camps Field House? I wondered if you wanted to talk a little bit about that and perhaps why personally you got involved in that.
Well, Camps Field House was an immigration removal centre, a detention centre close to Oxford, so it was nearby. And I think I probably got involved when I was first asked if I'd go and do a bit of interpretation for someone who was a French-speaking African and for the person who was trying to help him with an application for bail. Because the people detained in these detention centres, there's been between 2,000 and 2,500 people at any one time, and up to 30,000 a year. They have no idea when they'll get out. They often have no idea why they've been detained. And so getting bail became a really key thing to try and enable them to be at least outside while their asylum claim or whatever their application was being considered. And the man I met, he was somebody who'd been born in one West African country, moved to another at the age of 8, was in a part of a country that was in revolt against the government, so there was violence. There was also drought. So the family raised money to put him on a boat, and he, made a boat journey across to the Canaries and then to Spain, and then his way up to Britain on a lorry, entering irregularly in the hope of encountering some contact that they had. It might have been a distant relative, but was picked up, stuck in detention. Didn't understand why, said, "I've committed no crime." And the horrific thing about this was that he was pushed around the detention estate for 2.5 years before finally being deported. His claim was refused. And we learned about this, because you don't know where people go once they've been moved on, from a friend of my husband's who was a chaplain to another detention centre, and he'd met up with him there, and this man had mentioned us. So that whole story the whole system is so flawed. It produces untold misery, and I think what I felt I could do in regard to detention was work with others on our bail observation project, because having seen that bail could provide an opportunity of a limited conditional freedom, we then looked at how the bail hearings were being conducted, and that was a bit of a shocker too. Some bail hearings were conducted very correctly, but an awful lot, it was very unpredictable what would happen. The Home Office would produce summary reports which contained inaccuracies. Interpretation might be inadequate. I know that at one hearing that I went to, the person who was on the end of a video link, they weren't in the court, hardly had the opportunity to say anything, because it seemed to be felt that interpretation took a lot of time. So you weren't getting the fair hearing that you needed for your case to be heard. And together with Bill McKeith, who was a founder member of the Closed Camps Field campaign, I co-authored a couple of reports on the observations that a group of volunteers made on bail hearings. And I think this has helped, and more law students are now doing this. And when there's someone in the public gallery, which previously there wasn't, I think it does have an observer effect. So one can hope that there's more awareness and maybe better practice.
Yeah, I mean, that's something that I've heard as well from him. I only went a couple of times to something that Quakers were doing in Doncaster, and that's, it must have been a few years ago now. But
yes, the Conversation Club.
Yeah, and they were people there were telling those kinds of stories and had those kinds of experiences as well of sort of receipt, having minutes to make their case, often in a different language without the proper support to do it. So yeah, I mean, you say that Campsfield is not there anymore. What's the story
building
behind
is
that?
still there, but it's been closed as a detention centre. It was closed just before Christmas. I think about half the people who were there were sent to Harmondsworth Detention Centre, and I think a number were released. The numbers had gone down very substantially, but I think it came as a surprise to us all that it was closed. I mean, we've been campaigning for it to be closed for 25 years, but it also came as a surprise to us and to the local MP.
But its closure, did that signal any kind of change in how people are being treated in these places, or is it just sort of moving it to a different part of the country, perhaps?
I think it's moving things around, but 4 centres have been closed. There are still 7 that are open, and I don't think the regimes. Well, I think it's been demonstrated that if someone is held in those conditions with the uncertainty of when they'll ever get out, after people say 28 days, but it's probably could be sooner than that, your mental health really deteriorates. It's living in prison-like conditions with uncertainty. If you have been convicted of a crime and you're in prison, you have a tariff. You have some expectation of knowing when you will be released. It is not the case for people in detention. And while some may be released very fast and some may be simply removed from the country, there are some who've been around for years. The Quaker Asylum and Refugee Network is going to meet in Doncaster in July. We move our regular quarterly meetings round, so I shall look forward very much to hearing what friends have been doing there.
Is it fair to say there's a sense of, by having that network and talking to each other, that's a very helpful function of Quan? Well,
I can give an example of that actually, because a young woman in a family I know here in Oxford was put in Yarl's Wood Immigration Removal Centre, and that's in Bedford, and I mean it's very difficult to get to, and I don't have a car from Oxford. It's not so difficult from London. So I put an appeal to a friend I knew in the network who lives in Bedford, and she is a visitor to Yarl's Wood, and she very kindly went and visited this young woman, and eventually my friend got out, and now I'm very happy to say that she has leave to remain. But she was saying that when our Quaker friend visited her, she said, she brought 3 pairs of knickers in different sizes in case I hadn't been given time to pack any underwear. So I think that gives you an example of both how the networking worked and also the practical support.
Is it difficult to get access to people in the detention centres?
They usually have to ask for you. They have to ask for a visitor. I've not been involved in regular visiting, but there is an organisation in Oxford called Asylum Welcome, which has been there virtually since the centre opened in 1993. And they've had a regular visiting regime with people going and trying to support the people in the centre, and a coordinator. What I've been involved with is I took out some shares in the company so that I could speak at the AGM. And as a result, I think, of my husband speaking at the AGM at one point, it was agreed by the company that there should be a stakeholder meeting in the centre with management. So we felt obviously it made sense to invite all the organisations in Oxford who had a connection, and the Asylum Welcome volunteer coordinator used to come along and had some very useful information to bring to management from the visitors who'd been visiting there. We also had the Red Cross, we had bail for immigration detainees, and medical justice. The medical justice does medical legal reports for people held in detention in order to try and enable them to get released on bail. And quite often people are held who should not be under the Home Office's own regulations. We met every half year, and then we realised something was changing when we were told our December meeting had been cancelled, and then we heard the centre was closing.
You said before that you're talking about it being a company. I mean, that surprises me instinctually. That
yes, the private sector makes an enormous amount of money out of misery.
Right. So it's privatised, and because that's
most are in private hands. But of course, if you're running something for profit, that also affects. Well, it affects the whole thing really, because you don't want to run a hotel with only half the people present, and so I suspect you don't want to run a detention centre with only half the detainees. So the decisions which are made administratively by the Home Office on who to detain, I mean, I would be very interested to know whether there's a target number to, to fill the centres. But that's entire speculation on my part.
I wonder, something that people might be wondering, certainly when I've had conversations of this nature with people who haven't necessarily been as heavily involved, one thing that's come up is about justice and laws, and actually people will say things like, well, we have to put limits on the number of people coming in, immigrants who come in and obey the law are fine, but not the rest, or things like that. You have a rich experience with this work. What would your response be to those kinds of questions?
Well, I think the first thing I'd say is that there's probably no legal and safe way you can get into this country if you are an asylum seeker, or you come in irregularly anyway. So that in itself, if you're claiming asylum, should not be regarded as questionable. I don't really understand why there's detention when there's perfectly possible alternative ways of managing immigration. After all, the majority of people are not detained, and if you are out on bail, you have to report. So, to a reporting centre. So I don't know. I mean, it seems to me that there is so much mythology, some of which has really been stirred up by some of the popular press, which gets the numbers wrong and fails to understand that people have a right to protection. And if somebody overstays their visa, I don't really understand why they should be held in detention for years. They've overstayed, and therefore something has to be looked at there. The other thing that I think is a profound injustice is that people who have been here legitimately, legally for many years, but who have a foreign passport and who commit a crime for which they serve a custodial sentence of more than 12 months, are then slated for removal. So they can be held in detention often longer than other people, although they've already served their sentence. And that seems to be double punishment. And certainly the judge in one hearing, when he heard that someone had been detained for 2 years, said, "You've expiated your crime, I'm letting you out on bail." And if this person had been a British national, he would have been probably, simply released or out on license. So I don't understand why there are different rules. I also think that there's a real, I think it's almost a fear, or playing on a fear, that the other, whoever they may be, are probably criminals anyway. So I actually had a conversation once with a Home Office official who said that the people in Campfield House were all criminals, but they weren't. This is simply not correct. They might have come into the country irregularly, but that doesn't make you a criminal. I see that currently there's a suggestion that people in the Windrush generation who got wrongly removed home, some of them may not be allowed back because they had committed a crime at some point. They'd served their sentence. So there's this whole fear of foreigners being something to be feared and kept out, particularly if they come from Africa or Asia. I think our European friends are now beginning to feel that it's very difficult.
Yeah, it does seem to be a kind of racial dimension to it.
Oh, I think there's no doubt about that. Yeah, because there's also a racial dimension to people who get, the sentences of people convicted of petty crimes. So there's a whole loop of stuff that's so complex. I'm not sure we can cut through that Gordian knot in this conversation. Mm-hmm. But the Refugee Council and Global Justice and various other people have produced lots of material, lots of factual evidence to demonstrate that a lot of what is said in the popular press is simply not true. But actually, you don't convince feelings with facts. So it's really trying to raise awareness about how our hearts and minds can be ordered in a different direction.
And I suppose in amongst all of that, one of the things that I guess stands out for me is that there seems to be an increasing number of cases of people being deported, and then that's having to be reversed, and they're being brought back into the country because the deportation wasn't legal. To me.
Yes, and actually quite a lot of money has been paid out over the years in compensation for wrongful removal. And I suppose one of our fears, when we heard that Campsfield was to close, we had very qualified pleasure at that news, because we felt that it might mean that people whose application had not yet been processed would be turned around quickly and sent back from where they came without, access to justice. And I think that the action of the Stansted 15 in stopping the deportation flight of people to West Africa has actually demonstrated the evidence of this, because I believe that 11 of those on board are still in this country because their cases hadn't been fully processed, and 2 have in fact received right to remain. So removing people forcibly before their case has been fully heard is really happening.
I mean, that's sort of staggering, really, when you think about it, isn't it? And particularly in the case of the Stansted 15, where they blocked that plane, and obviously have now, been charged for it, and yet clearly were preventing an injustice that the legal system's also.
I entirely agree, and I think what is very difficult for us to understand is why the charge was escalated to become such a grave one.
So if I was to ask you what you felt was a Quaker perspective on immigration, what would you think? What would your response be?
Oh, I think my response would be the usual one, that there's no single Quaker view on anything, except, very broadly, peace with justice and encountering that of God in everyone, and that should be your guide for how you then respond. There can be no peace if we transact some of our law with violence, which is what happens in the current immigration and asylum policy and practice. I don't think things are going to change anytime soon. I feel very encouraged by the number of people who now are very active in trying to challenge that hostile environment and say, with the sanctuary meetings, we want to welcome, we want to be hospitable, and we want to challenge injustice. And, I think there have been about 10,000 people have been to northern France and Calais since the jungle was first established and then demolished. And that's a very large number who all have friends and family to whom they will speak. And of course, there's been many Quakers among them. I only went to the jungle once, and it was only for a day trip. But I think it's very important that we all, in a way, pull together. And Quakers should always work with others where we can, because in that way we can make quite a difference in saying no, in being resistant to what we see as injustice and things that are really offending our sense of how the world should be. After all, we've been we've been struggling for peace for over 300 years. It hasn't exactly broken out, but we're not going to stop. I think the other thing is to say is we do need also to be aware of how we can get a bit worn out, and then that can affect our judgment. And I'm very pleased that the Sanctuary program is offering retreats to those who really do work at the front line with people who've gone through terrible experiences, because you will feel some of it yourself, and you need to recognize that. I think there's a saying that if you do not heal what hurt you, you will bleed on the person who didn't cut you. Yes, keep on going, and be kind to yourself and everyone.
I was actually taken aback recording that sometimes the stories that we hear when recording the podcast, you know about it, and then when you actually start to delve into it over a length of time, particularly people who are doing this work, it can be quite moving, and it kind of makes it feel worthwhile making sure those stories are because so often they don't seem to be told. I mean, one of the things recently that happened with the Stansted 15, who were a bunch of activists that were blockading a deportation at Stansted Airport. They received some quite dubious convictions, but it really raised a lot of this stuff up, that stuff about that Bridget talked about, people who were deported or were going to be deported and actually their case hadn't been properly heard, or some of the harrowing stuff about, people not having basic supplies in detention centres. It's quite, I don't know, it's shocking stuff, and but it's also part of a much bigger picture, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think the one thing that I take away from kind of both the conversations that we had was about there is some really clear sort of visioning that needs to happen about the whole system of immigration and what that looks like. And certainly sort of the Quaker take on it would be to have the vision, be more idealistic about it, but that also sometimes those practical steps of making things a little bit better, and then a little bit more better, and a little bit better again. Sometimes those things are just as important as challenging the entire system, because people do need basic supplies when they're in detention, but we also need to fight the system of immigration detention itself. And
that stuff can often start as well with looking at yourself, and I think that's been a really important part of this, is if we're going to challenge institutional racism and racism in general and all of this stuff that's wrong in the world, we also have to look at ourselves, don't we?
Yeah, because if underpinning our system of immigration is racism, then we also need to think about how that can be challenged in our everyday lives, about standing up against some of those things.
Yeah, so one of the things that's been put together, partly as a result of this work, but also more broadly examining inclusion and privilege and what that means in the 21st century, is the Power and Privilege Toolkit you can get a download of, which we'll put in the show notes, that really starts to kind of just help ease into that stuff. And of course this is part of the conversation that we had when we recorded the Allyship podcast. For me as a Quaker, it all fits really quite clearly together in terms of that idea of equality and that of God and that spiritual experience and how we worship, and then the work that we do in the world and how we interact with the world. It seems quite complex, but actually for me it's all part of this picture of living as a Quaker and challenging injustice and seeing that of God in everyone, as Quakers often put it, that actually comes quite naturally and flows into each other.
Yeah.
So that's kind of a Quaker take on immigration, I guess. As ever, if you have any questions, you can email us. elizabethp@quaker.org.uk. Or you can find us on the Quakers in Britain communications channels at British Quakers on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook.
And YouTube.
Yeah, we put most of the podcast episodes on YouTube as well these days. So if you know people that enjoy listening in that way, and they will come with a transcript as well, don't they?
Yeah, they do.
If you know people who prefer to read, then that's another option.
Yeah, thanks for listening.
Thank you for listening to the first podcast of 2019. Go well,
friends.